Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSPmagazine. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
And hello, everybody. You're very welcome to a new episode of Redefining Cybersecurity here on ITSPmagazine. This is Sean Martin, your host, where I have the pleasure of trying to figure out how to operationalize security so that the business can succeed safely versus being blocked from technology and people who think they both know better than the business does. It's a balance, and I have an interesting, it's not interesting, a common view, but maybe not one that's so common that it's widespread and proficiently employed, but looking at this from the viewpoint of risk. and I'm fortunate to be part of a program at Pepperdine Grazidio Business School, and love the topic of risk. So when I was introduced to Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Sorry, Sean.
I'll go by Steve today. That's cool.
Yeah.
Maybe depends where the conversation goes. I might want to be Steve.
Yeah.
No, but when I was introduced to you and this topic, I was like, yes, please. Can never talk about it enough, because I think it's really the starting point for many. Well, the original starting point is, what do you want to accomplish? And you have to bake the risk conversation into that. I think a lot of folks jump straight to controls. Well, maybe I should wrap some policies around that, or this new company has this new stuff to offer. Let me see how I can fit it in. And I think generally we often miss the whole point of risk management, which can be hard to deal with sometimes. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and it's rooted in a book that you wrote, Understand, Manage, and Measure Cyber Risk: Practical Solutions for Creating a Sustainable Cyber Program. Which is two things, right?
Catchy title, first of all.
the intersection there.
Yeah.
You do one to lead to the other, which is kind of my point, I guess, that I made earlier. But before we get into all the fun bits that people who geek out on risk like us do will enjoy, tell them a little bit about who Ryan is and what you're up to.
Sure. So, well, first, thanks again for having me, Sean. So Ryan Leirvik, I've been in security for probably actually 20 years this year, since 2003. So finally hit the 2-decade mark. Largely, IT developer, database guy turned security individual when I'd secure the database that I was working on at the Department of Defense, and then turned pretty quickly into cyber warfare at DoD for just under 10 years. So spent a lot of time in that space, fell in love with the industry, and thought, this is kind of how I think, right? You can always look at systems and practical designs and architectures and say, all right, well, how's this going to fail, right? Like, where's this going to break? And if it does, why does it matter? So left that largely to go point towards the commercial space, say, all right, given as much that we rely on IT as sort of an enabler, right? And, IT is sort of imperfect, right? Let's not call it flawed, but call it imperfect. And then we keep stacking more imperfect technology on imperfect technology. The imperfections line up pretty well for nefarious individuals to sort of, get after critical information. So I've been spending a lot of time over the last 10 years on the commercial space, helping think through the problem and making sure that, helping add, at least a point of view on how do we keep the fundamentals top of mind when we hit issues like you just brought up, right? Like, what tools should we buy, right? Where should we hire? Where should we be focusing on from a practical standpoint from our programs, right? Like, and there didn't seem to be any handbook out there that's like, all right, if I wanted to pull all these things together and really from a practical sense, have an idea of what I should be paying attention to. I know I was grappling for something like that and it didn't exist. So just over time, started putting the pieces together, and launched a book a couple years ago that sort of acts as a playbook to just say, look, when we're stuck, here's 3 things to think about, from understanding what the risk is to managing it to putting measures in place to manage it. And just became a practical guidebook, I guess. So
Love it.
yeah, that's what we do.
Love it. Well, I'm excited to get into this, and I've never really thought about it this way before, but I think we share a common entry point into this world, in the database world, funny enough. And one of my first engineering projects, and we're talking mid-90s here to kind of set the stage. My first engineering project was it was a flat file database that essentially housed very sensitive private. I was working for a landscape company. Very sensitive private information about plant material and fertilizers and pests and abatement to protect the plants against the pests. And it was basically the company's secret sauce that they wanted to provide access to the people that worked there, not the competitors. And so they did a risk analysis and said, we need to provide this. We have to protect it. Sean, go off and figure out a way to do that. So that was kind of one of my first engineering projects, and it happened to be a security project as well, but driven by risk, right?
Yeah.
The company understood what the value of that information was and what we needed to do to protect it. And so I never really thought about it that way, but yeah, your thoughts on that?
And that's the core right there, right? Like, so I would argue that's the very essence of security, is understanding what's important and why it needs to be protected. Right? That's it. Everything else is sort of everything else, right? And this is, I think, some of the challenges that we see in security these days. It's like we see a new threat or new vulnerability or some new tool, and all of a sudden the questions around, like, great, what do we do about that threat? What do we do about that vulnerability? What do we do about that new tool? Let's go buy it. Let's do whatever, without actually thinking through. I mean, not always, but without immediately thinking through, all right, why does it matter, right? Is that particular threat pointed on something that's critical, like getting the fertilizer information right and understanding how it might be weaponized, right, in certain ways, right? Or a particular type of fertilizer that you want to keep the IP on, right? And it could be leaked, which if leaked, then you get copycats, and then all of a sudden your market share goes down. Like, why these things are important, right? Or the vulnerabilities that you might be putting on systems somewhere, right? And these are the challenges of, like, do we even know what's important? And I find that, like, the more we get away from that, the more busy we become, but less secure we become, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that, so let's unpack this a little bit. We can use my example or yours or others. That doesn't really matter to me. So I think generally, and I'm trying to think back if they articulated all the reasons why it was important. I don't know that it mattered to me. And this may be an interesting point. I don't know if it mattered to me, if it's important, or how or why it was important, just that it was, and what they didn't want to happen to it. And in those days, I mean, I was also responsible for a lot of infrastructure development and deployment. We're setting up lines between offices, right, direct T1s and things like that. So pre broad spread internet type thing. So access to it as a publicly facing web app was not an issue, right? It was a desktop app available to only certain people, presumably. So the scope was very different. So I guess a couple points there I guess we can talk about. One is they told me it was important and why it was important, not in every situation. So I just kind of knew that I had to do something, and I knew the scope of where it was kind of vulnerable, understanding the network, that it wasn't going to be on that, or how it was. I think it ultimately was on the network as well. But so let's unpack that a little bit. Kind of the description, communication around understanding the risk.
Yeah.
And
that's
maybe scoping the controls around it.
Yeah. And that is the hard part, because not a lot of times, but generally you can see where you're either told it's important and don't understand why, but you have the authority to keep it safeguarded, right? Or on the flip side, sometimes organizations are in a situation where there is critical information or critical assets, right? Connected networks, connected applications that do connect to things that are critical, that may not be seen as critical, but you as the practitioner recognize if they were to fail, you could have some level of massive impact to the organization. but the organization doesn't know it's critical. Right? So there's two sides of it. And to unpack that a little bit, Sean, to use your terminology here, no matter what it is, there's almost like this lack of a rubric around like how we categorize our assets, right? I mean, there's a plenty that are coming out now, and we're seeing some of them over the last couple of years, which is good. But a way to actually identify like what do we mean by critical, and a variety of different examples, have been out, or but I'm not seeing the crisp ones show up enough as we'd like. I mean, like NIST, has a good definition in the IR 7621, I think. It sort of breaks it down into 5 categories, right? It's like lost work, lost access, incident response, fees. That's like your IR teams, you have to pay out legal fees, and lost work, and lost business, right? If having a way of actually looking at this from an organizational standpoint of what the actual impact is, right, is wildly helpful to sort of weed out what is important and what is not important, right? They're all, or let's just put it in normal parlance, like what's critical and what's not critical. So in the fertilizer situation, like if the organization's, intellectual property is the makeup of that fertilizer, I would assume, right? Like that's why I made it critical, right? So they want to keep the recipe. Yep. Okay. So that's sort of your, number one crown jewel, if you will, right? The impact of that coming out would be what, right? The impact of that being leaked, of what the actual formula is again, we talked about it a few minutes ago, like copycats taking it, right? As long as it's not like there's not legal protection around it, right? Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. So it doesn't stop people, as we see. But competitors could use something similar, right? Or start butting up against the patent. And next thing you know, like your ability to serve the market based on your research and development that you've put in for that particular product, right? To get there, and you're expecting a return on that through your sales, wildly diminishes your ability to service the market if somebody comes in and undercuts you because they don't have to make up that R&D cost. So even though at the time, as a database administrator, or at least putting things together, you may not know why it's critical, the fact that they're able to identify that it's critical and put safeguards around it and prioritize it says that, okay, at least we know from a security standpoint what problem we're solving for. We're solving for, zero exposure of the mix that is in, X fertilizer, right? And that gets, just having that simple definition and understanding for all the security team or practitioners or even IT folks, be it database or network engineers, or however the rest of the corporate network is architected and deployed, right? Understanding what's critical immediately puts hyper focus, on those that are actually in the deployment phase or in the architecture phase or even in the procurement side, to know we need to be protecting this information in ways, and it at least heightens the awareness, if nothing else, if you don't have controls or standards or procedures around it. So just a simple definition of categorizing it that way as as critical matters, so that people know what's important. Right.
Yeah. An excellent point, because as I alluded to at the beginning, it was basically just a flat file of a bunch of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
And somebody accessed it and was able to look through it all and use it for whatever purpose they wanted. There was really no logic.
Some notes document somewhere.
Right. So to your point, maybe kind of similar to that, just formatted
right.
a certain way. But in a more complex world, now granted, this is early days, and it was a cool use of technology to provide access to information that people wouldn't have gotten access to otherwise. But start throwing business logic around it, right? Different use cases, different users, different scenarios, different context. Maybe parts of that data are important to protect, not all of it. Maybe different contexts, open and closed, different paths to different parts of the data. And so understanding, to your point earlier, why and what, the what really matters in that sense too. So it was a blanket scope of just protect this. But if that thing grew out and was web facing and had multiple users in different roles and different data sets that had to be manipulated specific ways, it gets a little more complex, right?
It does, yeah. And the way to sort of break down the complexity that I've seen the work is a really easy trick, right? Is what's really important to the business versus what's important to the individual, right? And so if you can answer that, sometimes it helps you sort of, push you more into what's going to have impact on the business, should it get out or leaked or compromised in any way, right? Or manipulated, right? Which is a form of compromise. And the stuff that it won't be as impactful. Like, let's just go with the fact that I said earlier, like maybe not as important. Everything is important, but there are degrees of importance, right? So one big trick, and we see this a lot with insurance, right, is like, okay, well, what's critical, right? And for those that are running the algorithms and identifying sort of the underwriting pieces, like they think that the algorithms are a crown jewel, absolutely, 100%. But is it, right? Because what might be important to the individual to do their job may not be important to the outside. So how valuable is an algorithm on weather patterns in, Southern Florida for underwriting, let's say motor vehicles, right? Well, for the business, it's pretty important to get that number right. But if it were leaked, right, or exposed in some way, no one can use it, because if a competitor tried to use it, that's against the law, and they're probably not going to risk their business on using it, right? But what is important is what assets you're actually underwriting, right? How valuable are those assets? Where are they? Where are the keys to them? Where are the extra keys? Who has access to them? Right now, that's something that's important because it's valuable to the outside, right? And a quick trick could be, all right, is this valuable to an attacker or is this valuable to the business? And make the distinction between the two. Now you understand if it's important for the business, could have impact on the business. Now we're talking about something that's critical, right? Because if it's just important to an individual to do their job, although important for the job, and lost work could happen if it were compromised. But if it were leaked, from a data breach standpoint, maybe not as catastrophic to the business, right? So that's a simple way to look at it to start the conversation. And then of course you can push into all the the pieces that are out there now in terms of just running through a quick assessment of do we put a dollar value to it? Do we do a high, medium, low? I mean, they don't take time. It just takes dedicated effort to try to figure it out. And it's not easy. And again, back in in the context of, if we only had time to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's easy to look back on something and say, okay, that's how that was. What we did makes sense. Probably doesn't fly now, given where it might be with the advances in technology. But what I want to talk about here, which is I just jumped in and started talking about it.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or advice on, because I'm assuming that having a framework for how to have a conversation might be an important thing to have, and setting the stage for those who you're going to have that with, so they understand their role in that conversation, what you're bringing, what they're bringing, what the outcome is, might be helpful as well. And somebody like me jumping straight to, here's how this looks, might not be helpful. Maybe it is if it's storytelling driven, and that's part of the framework. But talk to me a little about, and maybe some of this is covered in your book, talk to me about kind of setting that frame, that stage, that relationship with the stakeholders.
Perfect. Yeah, we always need people who are ready to jump in. And so that's always that is usually the best. Two things. What I was surprised at is some of the fundamentals that we've kind of gotten away with. So to me, the initial framing, right, is, do we know what the risk actually is? Like, do we have a good definition of risk? And why is that important? Because it helps demystify what the risk is not, right? The pitfall to avoid in most risk conversations, is talking about pieces that don't necessarily apply to the risk, because we only have so many resources, right? Time being one, money, and effectively individuals to help solve the problem. So having a clear, crisp definition of risk, like the NIST-CSF 7621, or ISO's got a good one. There's a handful of ones out there that categorically define risks and define threats and vulnerabilities plus impact to the business. And as long as we're talking about impact to the business, you got a risk, right? So I mean, at the end of the day, from a corporate standpoint or an enterprise standpoint, we're in the risk management game, right? Trying to mitigate, identify the risks early on so you can mitigate it. And so the real challenge is inviting people into this world that don't come from it or find it very mysterious, right? So, I mean, look, cyber used to be information assurance, right? It's like, do we have certain controls in place to ensure that the information, like fertilizer, right, are protected in a way, even if it's a flat file, and we gotta load it in, what was the term back in the day? ETL it, right? Extract, transfer, and load it into another database, right? Somewhere that we're mindful of the sensitivity of the data, right? And there's that piece of it. But now it's gotten so complex. We call it cyber. Like, people don't understand the difference. Most people that aren't in technology have a hard time comprehending it. This is where frameworks can really come in, like standard frameworks, right? So, NIST, ISO, COBIT, HighMark, depending on what business you're in, right, or what industry you're in. You could use frameworks to say, all right, from a guideline standpoint, at least we can, again, same with risk, start categorizing these problems so we can invite our peers in to have conversations without using the word cyber or without using a technical term that may not be as well understood as, we might have, asset management, inventory management, patch management, right? Anything that has to do with, something that may need a little bit of understanding of the underlying problem that we're trying to solve. And these industry frameworks can be really helpful to get the conversation started. It's like, all right, great. Like NIST-CSF, they all have their merits, but the beauty of the CSF is it starts with 5 categories, soon to be 6, coming up in the fall of 23, right? That really home in on what the problem is. Okay, great. Like, number 1, identify. Okay, what does that mean? Know your most critical assets. We just spent a decent amount of time talking about it. Why is it important? Because that's where the risk is. If those ever are, compromised, not available, or the integrity of it falls down, like classic CIA model starts to break down, well, now the people and the organizations or the enterprises that rely on that, right, it becomes compromised, and the confidence in those systems or those assets or that information becomes compromised. Now we've got a problem because the business is at risk, right, at the end of the day. So the CSF starts there, right, and then sort of builds out from, all right, do we know what we're protecting? So this gets to the compensating controls, right? Do we have controls in place to protect what we know is important? Great, that's the next layer, right? Okay, what if those break down? Can we detect any threats, or can we monitor or discover any potential event that might do harm to the organization through breaking through the meaningful safeguards to get to the most important information, right? You see how you can sort of layer this in, and having a conversation with your peers and managers, or across or even above from the oversight or executive committee, you start to have a conversation where you're not even using the word cyber. You're not using mysterious terms. You're just saying, do we know it's important? Can we protect it? Can we detect it? Oh, and by the way, there's 2 other pieces that we always forget about, right? Which is, can we respond and can we recover quickly? Well, what do we mean by that? Great. Let's say there's an active threat. How quickly can we identify it and put a team in place to start identifying what's actually happening, right? You may or may not even get the attribution, but that's not the issue right away. The issue is that you've got visibility of it, you can see it, and now all of a sudden, like, you've got a team in place. Well, that's a really important question. So to have a category of respond really makes a difference for most organizations of any size, because if we spend too much time on protect and detect and not enough on what's important and responding, well, then who cares? Right? That's part of the issue. And then, of course, last but least, like, you get into the recover piece, like, all right, if we can't recover quickly, well, then the whole business can fail, right? Now, we know these models from basic risk management tools for a long time, right? In physical risk management for plants and others, for financial risk management. The challenge that we have in cybersecurity is, there's this mysterious layer more than it was in the financial world, right? Because at least financially, people can understand, hey, you've got money, you're deploying it in one place, taking it out from another, and there's a risk that it could get lost. Okay, it's a finite number, right? With some sort of currency involved. Here, it's a little bit different. There's systems, there are networks, right? There's applications, right? There's data, right? So there's a variety of different assets that can fall into this. So this is where frameworks come in pretty closely, or pretty tightly, I should say, to tighten up the conversation so that we at least have a starting point to jump in, if you will, right, and start working the problem. And it actually winds up being very helpful from deployment of assets, because now you can say, all right, do we actually know what's important? Great. All right. Now, do we know if we're protecting it? All right. How many assets can we put towards that? Right. Do we know how to detect it? Do we know how to respond and recover? And from a practical cybersecurity risk management standpoint, you basically get a roadmap, or at least an architecture of how to start building out your teams.
Yeah. So as we're talking about this, I'm just thinking that there's always the first step to anything IT and security, which is, well, what do we have?
Yeah.
So all right. The identification, the inventory, it always comes up, right? What do you have?
Yeah.
And then you have to figure out, well, what does it do? How important is it? How's it connected to the rest of the things? And getting that knowledge can be super difficult, right?
Yeah. Nearly impossible. I mean, small organizations have the benefit because you can probably talk to everybody about what they're using, and have you set up some rogue access points somewhere, right? That isn't, that you're bouncing through and using when you're far enough away from the corporate network or whatever. I mean, today's day and age is a little bit different, but from a physical standpoint. But large organizations, I mean, nobody does asset management well. Very few people do asset management really well. So you're in constant discovery of what's being connected to your enterprise, right? Be it any and all things, right? And the push to cloud hasn't necessarily made it better, right? Because then in times, and we see this quite a bit, the fundamental architecture, right? The rush to get something up and running sort of supersedes the monitoring and the access, credentialing and access, privileged access management in general, and then the architecture, so that at least from a monitoring or logging standpoint, the SOC or SIEM has some visibility into it. Those seem to go the wayside sometimes, just to quickly push into a new infrastructure that's automatically push button set up for you. And let's forget about that little private public toggle switch that could mean, oh, if it's critical data, let's put it private. So don't, release it to the world per se, or make it public and now everybody can find it. I mean, the ability to make errors now is a lot easier, and the stakes are higher than, they are or were a long time ago, right? And back to the layering of, imperfect technology and imperfect technology deployed imperfectly, right? It's a 3-tiered problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So my sense is that a lot of this, and maybe this makes it difficult as well, just if you can't get a full, complete picture, which, by the way, will change tomorrow anyway, you kind of have to have a big picture view of what's what, how do things work. And I think a lot of that comes down to, at least from my perspective, business logic, right? So these are the businesses we're in. These are the transactions we enable. These are the workflows that make that possible. And eventually you get down to the systems and that make it happen. But underneath that is all the data that you're also trying to protect for availability and confidentiality and integrity as well. So if that's at least partially true, how do we have a conversation then to uncover that in a meaningful way?
This is a hard part, right? And I'd be curious as to your thoughts on this, because in my experience, not everybody in the security world knows what the business actually does, right? From a marketing standpoint. I mean, look, let's be honest, like the management tech divide is still alive and well for sometimes good reasons and other times, not good reasons, right? And the reality of what the business actually does and what the business logic is required in order to meet the stated goals and objectives of the business may not be well understood. And and that is a problem in and of itself, not so much in the day-to-day activities of the security, because we can still do security without it, but understanding what's important to the business. we keep saying the business, or the enterprise, right? Whether you're in quote business or not, every organization has a mission, right? That you're organized for some reason, right? Be it anything across the spectrum from highly capital to widely benevolent, right? There's a wide spectrum there. But the issue is every organization is organized in a way to meet a stated objective. And the real question is like that quote business logic is really important to say, all right, what matters to the business? Because when we rely on the technology so much, that there may be instances where there's flaws or imperfections in it that really impact the overall mission, right? Critical infrastructure comes to mind right away, right? That the impact can be catastrophic. So in my view, and again, Sean, I'm curious of what you've seen here. Haven't necessarily seen a one-to-one relationship every time between those that are in security and an understanding of what the business does. So maybe that might be one way to really help understand what's critical and sort of make sure we've got the proper assets identified, which is almost impossible, right? Or at least compensating controls around them, quote defense in depth, right? In ways where we can start to identify pieces that let's say, how do we say this right, that could do harm to the business. If the more we understand the business architecture and what the stated goals and objectives of the business are, the easier it is to reduce the impact of that. But that's one way of looking at it.
Yeah, and I think there's no way around looking at the lowest level. At the lowest level, there's this system with this OS running these apps, these services, hosting this data and making it accessible through these connections.
Right.
How do we protect that, right? And there's a baseline level of security for all those elements, right? It may require multiple layers to kind of protect that thing, and then the data as it crosses, and so you kind of have those elements that I think we can't get away from.
Yep.
So somebody needs to understand that and attack this problem from that level. But I think where it becomes really interesting is having those conversations. And I apologize that I have to go here, but I keep thinking about generative AI, where instead of looking at a dashboard with a bunch of assets with labels that presumably mean something to somebody,
mm-hmm.
if I could ask a system a question, what does this business unit do,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
How does it do it? Draw me a diagram that shows me how things are set up to enable that business to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
I can then get a picture of, all right, I have some things on premises, I have some things in the cloud, I have these apps that we bought, I have these apps we built, I have these. I can start to drill down into figuring out what's underneath the hood. But at least in the big picture, I can see, all right, these are the critical areas of that workflow, and then these are the critical lines between the key transaction points in that workflow. Mm-hmm. And in those pipes are data sets that we care deeply about, and the transactions we care deeply about. And then that paints a picture that I think most people can have a conversation around, right? Then that translates and is the, I think that, while may be hard, I think is feasible. Forget ChatGPT or that thing, but having that conversation is feasible. I think translating that then into something IT and security can do something with, I think is probably more challenging, and it probably requires some tool sets or whatever to help with that. But so I think that's where the bottom up and the top down come together in some sense. If we can see what systems are heavily used, they have which networks have the most throughput, whatever, and kind of map that back to the business stuff, we can kind of then paint another picture that says, this is what's important to the business. This is where a lot of the stuff's happening under the hood. These are the exposure. Obviously, you have to look at the exposure and threat levels for those as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. That I'm probably just talking in circles here, but that's kind of my view on this.
It's great. And this is where, database administrators or folks that come from the data world have a sort of a leg up on this, right? Mm-hmm. So where you and I came from, right, in terms of identifying what data needs to go where and how we, either normalize it or put it all together. This is where the generative AI matters. What data sets are you pointing it at? What's it using, right? To form the, where the machine's pointed towards to get the logic to then learn, right, and move forward, and what's in and what's out. And when you have sort of call it a legacy point of view, right, from sort of the old school data days, right, you can see this, like, well, if you're not looking at certain data sets, you'll miss some of those critical nodes. So for example, there are, let's not say a decent amount, but there are a number of, let's go into the technical debt world, right, for a moment. Organizations, like the IT is enabler. Let's go back to that as well, right? So you've got this IT as enabler. Organizations don't necessarily spend a lot. Don't. Wow, that's a wild generality. So the key here is that organizations may or may not spend a lot on tech refresh, if you will, and they may not refresh all of the technology, right? Large organizations just don't do that typically from a capital expenditure standpoint, right? So if you're pointing sort of this new generative AI and you understand where the code is and how it's actually thinking and learning, if you're missing data sets that may be in some tape backup storage somewhere that didn't get pulled over to the operational side, you may miss things that only happen every 5 or 6 years, right? And now you've got a warped sense of what might be critical when you forget, every 5 years, we have to have this particular report for this federal agency or this, compliance piece or whatever the case is, some, 40% owner that asks for this every 5 years. If we're not looking at the complete data set, then the output may sound great and feel great, but it's incomplete. And, this is where that legacy data understanding of what the whole picture looks like first, sort of matters, right? And you can see how this, wherever we point it can, I don't want to say go off the rails, but the picture can be incomplete pretty quickly if the data sources aren't holistic, right? I mean, that's a thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I mean, we can look at GPT 3, 5, 4, whatever, limited to up to 2021, right? So you're going to get interesting stuff that might be valuable and useful and meaningful, but not complete.
Right. Yeah. Because some of the data is just not queryable. Like it's or the opposite. It is queryable, but the lookup, if you will, doesn't know to look for it or can't ingest it when it does show up. Right. Think back to the flat files, like whatever it was delimited by, like, comma, tab, pipe, whatever. It's like, if you've missed the commas, you're not going to get that data set because didn't know to look for them. I eliminated from the query because I just figured, it might be a sentence. Right?
Structured, unstructured data.
That's right. Yeah. And this is what gets so interesting with just the fundamentals, right? The more we sort of push up the stack without that common through line of, hey, this is the type of data or type of system or network that's really critical to the business. Without really fundamentally understanding that, we do ourselves a bit of a disservice, by hyper focusing on other places, because then we're missing the thing that, by the way, the attacker's going to find because we're not looking at it, and all of a sudden we'll have an issue. Right now, I say that tongue in cheek because it's really hard to get all these things under management or even understand what they are. But at a fundamental level, it still is it's a goal worth pursuing, because if we know what we own, right, and we know what's important, then we have at least we've got a half solved problem, right? Because it's well defined, and now it's a function of, all right, protecting it in a way that we protect the access controls, we protect the access to it, right? The pathways, and of course the use and a manipulation of the information. But without focusing on that, right? Next thing we know, we're focused on the tooling around it. We're going to miss the core piece. right? Yeah. So
So
it always comes back to the fundamentals in some way.
I know,
right?
I know, and that's where I want to go next, because I mean,
Yeah.
in the Pollyanna world that I described, where there's some executive level committee having these conversations that paint a nice picture,
Yeah.
probably not going to happen anytime soon. And security is still sitting there trying to figure out, well, where do I invest? How do I ensure the controls are in place and that the investments are providing the return on risk mitigation that the company's expecting of me?
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah. And
how do we get there as we kind of wrap up here?
oh, great. Yeah. So Sean, three simple things. And again, these aren't easy, but they're simple, right? One, understanding what we're talking about when we talk about risk, right? Defining the risk problem. Okay, great. Then having it under management. All right, what are we using from a framework standpoint to guide the program? And that will help line up the initiatives, activities or initiatives that the organization is funding to address the cybersecurity problem, the risk problem. That's number one, right? And if we do that in a way that's sufficient, in other words, we've got categorical definitions of what we're trying to look for. So like any one of the frameworks do this, right? You can line up activities to them, who actually owns them, what date, they're due by. So you can actually, it's like a program management list, right? Then we can assign measures to it, which is the last part, to say, hey, do we even know if we're doing well? How do we know what percentage of assets we have identified as critical? Like, how do we know how many employees are passing the annual application management policy awareness program, right? How do we even know like the time to discovered threat to response activity, right? These are ways to sort of bring all those things in context. So at least everyone's on the same page. And once you get everybody on the same page, right, regardless of what the page looks like, everybody's on it, Yep. And like that again, a well-defined problem becomes half solved, because now you can invite other people into the problem set without using words like cyber, without using, words that we love and we understand, but may not be understood in HR or in procurement, right? Especially when it comes to third-party risk, right? Or in the legal community, right? And it gets us all on the same page to say, all right, well, we know what we're measuring. We know what we're managing, so we know what we're measuring, right? And then we can change the measures over time as we start to mature. And now at least we've got a program to start playing, and start moving forward to at a fundamental level. That then back to your sort of, the proverbial boardroom where these conversations are happening, we have a fundamental place like, okay, do we know what problem it is we're solving for? Are we all on the same page? Yeah, okay, great. Because you have smart people in the room that are, there for a reason. Question is, do we have a rubric or a framework or a way of thinking through the problem that, eliminates the assumptions and puts the point squarely on what the problem really looks like, right? And this is just one way to do it.
Yeah, it gives those people an opportunity to contribute in a way that matters, right?
That's right.
And not, to your point, on assumptions, but also just, well, I don't think I know, so I'm not going to contribute because I don't want to influence in a way that's not helpful. When in fact, if you can actually open it up for them to be helpful and them being comfortable in doing so, you're going to get a much better picture of that. So
yeah, Sean, it's like an architecture.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's the distinction of saying, hey, go build me something. And the best person who builds the best bathrooms in the world is sitting back going, I don't know what they're building, so I'm not going to say anything. And next thing you know, you have an office building with no bathrooms. But if you come and say, hey, we're going to build an office building, which means we need parking, right? We need restrooms. And all of a sudden, the bathroom person in this scenario says, oh, great. Well, how many do we need? And because if you lay out the architecture first and say, this is how we're going to walk through this problem set, now you invite people in to contribute that might have something you may not have expected. Yeah. It's a good point.
My question is, how many cafes are on each floor?
Yeah, because we need our coffee.
And how close are the restaurants? Exactly. So I'm driven by food and coffee. But super cool conversation, Ryan. And I think my brain hurts thinking about this a little bit, but in a good way. So I'm sure those listening are probably trying to unravel some things. And that's where I kind of go back to the frameworks you mentioned. We can include some links for those. I'll ask you to help me make sure we have the right ones there. And of course, your book that helps kind of guide folks through some of this as well. You probably include the frameworks in the book too. So,
hands down. Yep.
So
And
I
some
think that,
some practical examples. So it's like, hey,
I
stuck
love that.
here, use
Yeah.
this. It's almost like it's like a guidebook, right? So
Nice.
where are you stuck? Stuck in this part of the problem? Great. Read that particular piece, implement it,
Nice.
see if it works, move on to the next one, or don't.
Or don't.
Yeah. Right? Yeah.
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 I think we'll cover. I'll recap with 2 points. Don't be afraid to jump in like I did, but don't be afraid to put some framing around it as well, so you know that you're actually doing something that matters.
Exactly. Know you're solving
So,
the right problem, right? We
exactly.
love problem solvers, but
Yeah.
the question is, are we solving the right one?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right on, Ryan. Well, thanks for having this chat with me and being part of the show, and thanks everybody for listening. Of course, if you have your own thoughts or ideas, I'd be very open to hear them on social media. Of course, if you like the conversation, share it with your friends and your enemies, and subscribe, all that good stuff. As you probably are figuring out, I'll put notes that include the links to Ryan's book and his profile and whatnot, so you can connect with him as well. And stay tuned. Much more coming, obviously, on Redefining Cybersecurity here on ITSPmagazine. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Sean.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you learned something new and this story made you think, then share ITSP Magazine with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our columns. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.